In the early months of 1941, America watched the spreading war in Europe and Asia with a mixture of anxiety, distance, and uncertainty. While battles raged across the Atlantic and Hitler's armies crushed nation after nation, another storm was quietly forming across the Pacific. Japan, hungry for resources and determined to dominate Asia, had already invaded China, occupied French Indochina, and set its sights on the oil-rich territories of Southeast Asia. But one obstacle stood in the way of its ambitions: the United States Pacific Fleet anchored at Pearl Harbor. For decades, relations between the United States and Japan had been deteriorating. American sanctions and an embargo on oil threatened Japan's war effort, and diplomatic talks, though ongoing, were little more than a fragile facade. Behind closed doors, Japanese planners had already concluded that war with America was not only inevitable, it was necessary for their empire's survival. They believed that if the U.S. Pacific Fleet could be crippled in a single lightning strike, Japan would have free rein to seize territory and fortify a defensive perimeter before America could recover. That plan would become one of the most infamous military operations in history. By late November 1941, 6 Japanese aircraft carriers and a strike force of more than 350 planes were crossing the North Pacific under radio silence, heading toward the Hawaiian Islands. Their commander, Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, carried the weight of a mission that would reshape the world. It was audacious, risky, and unprecedented. No nation had ever before launched such a large carrier strike so far from home. Yet for Japan, this was the gamble of an empire. As dawn approached on December 7, 1941, the quiet of Oahu's Sunday morning seemed unbreakable. Sailors slept in their bunks or prepared for a relaxed day off duty. The battleships of Battleship Row, USS Arizona, USS Oklahoma, USS West Virginia, and others rested calmly in the harbor, their crews entirely unaware that they were minutes from being thrust into the flames of history. At 7:48 a.m., the calm shattered. The first wave of Japanese aircraft fighters, bombers, and torpedo planes swept down from the clouds, engines screaming, sunlight glinting off the red rising suns painted on their wings. Within seconds, explosions tore through the harbor, torpedoes ripped into the sides of the battleships, bombs fell with terrifying accuracy. Hangars, fuel depots, airfields, and runways erupted in fire. The attack was swift, brutal, and overwhelming. Aboard the USS Arizona, a single bomb ignited the forward magazine, triggering a catastrophic explosion that ripped the ship apart in a blinding fireball. Over 1,000 sailors were killed in an instant, one of the deadliest moments in American military history. On the USS Oklahoma, the ship capsized after being hit by multiple torpedoes, trapping hundreds of men inside. Others leapt into burning oil-covered water, fighting to survive against flames, debris, and gunfire. Yet even amid the chaos, acts of extraordinary courage emerged. Young men, still dazed from sleep, sprinted to anti-aircraft guns, firing at enemy planes despite having no orders. Teams of sailors risked their lives to rescue comrades from flooded compartments. Pilots sprinted across airfields under strafing fire, trying to get their fighters into the sky. A handful succeeded, engaging Japanese aircraft despite the overwhelming odds. The second wave of attackers arrived just as the flames were reaching their peak. More bombs fell, more ships were struck, and more airfields destroyed. Yet the Japanese failed to deliver the knockout blow they hoped for. America's aircraft carriers, USS Enterprise, USS Lexington, and USS Saratoga, were not in port that day. They were at sea, spared from destruction. And in the long war that followed, aircraft carriers would become the decisive weapon. By the time the attack ended around 10 a.m., smoke blackened the sky above Pearl Harbor. Battleships lay in ruins or burning. Over 2,400 Americans were dead. Hundreds of aircraft were destroyed. The Pacific Fleet had been devastated. But the attack had also unleashed something Japan had never expected: the unified fury of a nation. President Franklin D. Roosevelt, addressing Congress the next day, called December 7th, a date which will live in infamy. His words echoed across the country, igniting outrage and determination. Men lined up at recruitment offices. Factories switched to wartime production. The isolationist spirit that had gripped America for decades evaporated overnight. Japan had indeed awakened a giant one that would not rest until victory was secured. The attack on Pearl Harbor did more than begin America's entry into the Second World War. It transformed the very nature of naval warfare. The age of the battleship was over, swept away in a morning of fire and steel. In its place rose a new titan, the aircraft carrier. Suddenly, the ability to project air power across vast oceans became the central measure of a navy's strength. The Pacific would become the testing ground for this new form of war. A war fought not just by ships, but by planes, submarines, and intelligence networks stretching across thousands of miles. In the wake of the disaster, American engineers, sailors, and strategists worked around the clock to rebuild the Pacific Fleet. Damaged ships were raised and repaired. New carriers were laid down. Training intensified. Codebreakers were mobilized. And while Japan celebrated its success, the United States was preparing for something far greater: a counterstrike that would soon reverse the course of the entire Pacific War. The attack that was meant to cripple America had instead forged a nation united with purpose. And as the smoke cleared over Pearl Harbor, the first chapter of a titanic struggle had begun. Ahead lay a chain of battles that would stretch across oceans and islands, fought by steel giants and brave men who would decide the fate of the Pacific. In the months following Pearl Harbor, America found itself in a race against time. Its Pacific Fleet was battered, its battleships sunk or crippled, and Japanese forces surged across the Pacific like a rising tide. Hong Kong, Wake Island, the Philippines, Guam one after another, they fell to the seemingly unstoppable advance of Imperial Japan. Yet even as territory was lost, the United States still possessed a weapon Japan had failed to destroy: its aircraft carriers. These carriers would soon become the centerpiece of a new American strategy, one that would transform the war at sea. No longer would battleships line up and trade salvos as they had for decades. The Pacific War would be decided by aircraft launched from the decks of giant floating airfields, capable of striking hundreds of miles away. It was a revolution in naval warfare, and it began with the first major carrier versus carrier clash in history, the Battle of the Coral Sea. In early May 1942, intelligence intercepts revealed that Japan was preparing to seize Port Moresby in New Guinea, a position that would threaten Australia and tighten Japan's control of the South Pacific. But thanks to American codebreakers who had begun cracking portions of Japan's naval communications, the U.S. Navy had a remarkable advantage. For the first time, Admiral Chester Nimitz knew where Japan intended to strike before they struck. American carriers USS Lexington and USS Yorktown steamed toward the Coral Sea, determined to block Japan's advance. When the two fleets finally met, something unprecedented happened. Ships fought each other without ever seeing one another. The entire battle was waged by aircraft. Dive bombers screamed down upon Japanese cruisers. Torpedo planes skimmed the ocean's surface. Japanese fighters dueled U.S. Wildcats in the blue sky overhead, and deep below, the vast ships maneuvered blindly, guided only by scout planes and radio reports. The Lexington, nicknamed Lady Lex, fought valiantly, but after taking multiple bomb and torpedo hits, she succumbed to raging internal fires. She became the first U.S. fleet carrier lost in the war. Yet, despite the loss, the battle was a strategic victory. Japan turned back from Port Moresby. For the first time, their expansion had been checked, but an even greater test lay ahead. Japan had another far more ambitious operation in motion: the invasion of Midway Atoll, a tiny island outpost that guarded the approaches to Hawaii. The plan was bold: capture Midway, destroy America's remaining carriers, and force the United States to negotiate for peace. To achieve this, Japan gathered its most powerful fleet: 4 frontline aircraft carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, the same elite force that had struck Pearl Harbor. But once again, American codebreakers were one step ahead. Led by Joseph Rochefort, U.S. intelligence analysts confirmed that AF, the Japanese target, was indeed Midway. Admiral Nimitz responded with his own bold gamble. He would send every available carrier, USS Enterprise, USS Hornet, and the hastily repaired USS Yorktown to ambush the Japanese strike force. What followed was one of the most decisive battles in naval history. Before dawn on June 4, 1942, Japanese aircraft launched the first attack on Midway, bombarding the island's defenses. Meanwhile, American land-based planes scrambled to strike back, attacking in waves of torpedo bombers and fighters. One by one, these early attacks were shot down, often without scoring a single hit. Dozens of young American pilots perished in their desperate attempts to break through the Japanese fighter screen. Yet their sacrifices were not in vain. Low on fuel and ammunition after defending against the torpedo bombers, the Japanese combat air patrol was out of position when the next wave arrived: American dive bombers from Enterprise and Yorktown. Emerging from a break in the clouds, they found the Japanese carriers below them, decks cluttered with refueling planes and armed bombs. It was a moment of incredible luck and precise timing, one that would alter the course of the entire war. At 10:22 a.m., they struck. Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu were hit by a storm of bombs. Explosions erupted across their decks. Gasoline, ammunition, and armed aircraft turned each ship into a firestorm. In just 5 minutes, 3 of Japan's frontline carriers, the heart of its naval air arm, were mortally wounded. Only the Hiryu remained, and she struck back with a vengeance, launching waves that managed to hit and severely damage the Yorktown. But American aircraft soon located Hiryu as well, and by late afternoon, she too was ablaze and sinking. 4 Japanese carriers lost, Japan's best pilots gone, its offensive capability shattered. Midway was a staggering, almost unthinkable victory for the United States. What had begun as a desperate gamble had ended in a triumph that turned the tide of the war in the Pacific. Never again would Japan be able to mount an offensive of similar scale. From this point forward, the United States would seize the initiative. But victory came at a price. Many brave men had been lost in the skies above the Pacific torpedo squadrons decimated, dive bombers shot down, entire flights vanished into the sea. Their courage, sacrifice, and determination had bought America a chance at ultimate victory. With Japan reeling, the United States began its next phase, a grueling campaign through the Solomon Islands, beginning with Guadalcanal. Here, American sailors would face some of the most brutal night battles in naval history, fighting Japanese destroyers and cruisers at point-blank range. Carrier pilots would learn to operate in treacherous storms, dogfight over dense jungles, and strike convoys hidden along the coasts. Marines on the island would fight for every ridge and airstrip, desperately holding Henderson Field against relentless attacks. The Solomon Islands campaign was long, bloody, and exhausting, but it forged a new generation of American sailors and aviators, battle-tested, hardened, and ready for the offensive that would eventually push Japan back across the Pacific. Coral Sea had stopped Japan. Midway had broken its offensive power. The Solomons would prove that America was ready to fight back. The tide had begun to turn. By the end of 1942, the strategic landscape in the Pacific had transformed. Japan was no longer advancing. Instead, it was desperately holding on. America, awakened, mobilized, and fueled by a colossal industrial engine, was now on the offensive. And the fleet leading that advance was unlike anything the world had ever seen. Vast carrier task forces, modern battleships, fleets of submarines, and thousands of aircraft. It was a steel tide rolling steadily across the ocean, and nothing in its path would remain unchanged. America's strategy moving forward was simple, yet revolutionary. Island hopping. Instead of assaulting every Japanese stronghold, the United States would leapfrog across the Pacific, taking key islands, bypassing others, and cutting off entire garrisons from resupply. This approach saved countless lives and accelerated the return toward the Philippines, and eventually Japan itself. The first major test came at Tarawa in the Gilbert Islands, a tiny speck of land only 2 square miles in size, defended by thousands of Japanese troops who had turned it into a fortress. On November 20th, 1943, U.S. Marines stormed the beaches under murderous fire. Many landing craft were destroyed on the reefs. Marines waded hundreds of yards under machine gun bullets and artillery. The water turned red. The fighting raged for 3 brutal days before the island was secured. Tarawa was proof the road to Japan would be paved with sacrifice. But it was also proof that the United States could take even the most heavily fortified positions. From the Gilberts, the U.S. Navy advanced into the Marshall Islands, smashing Japanese defenses with overwhelming carrier air power and battleship bombardments. The new Essex-class carriers, massive, fast, and capable of launching dozens of aircraft, served as the backbone of the modern fleet. Alongside them sailed the Iowa-class battleships, the fastest and most advanced battleships ever built, armed with 16-inch guns that hurled shells weighing as much as small cars. This was the new face of naval warfare. Fleets of steel giants operating with precision, coordination, and firepower on a scale never before imagined. As 1944 progressed, America's strategy shifted into high gear. Admiral Raymond Spruance and Admiral William Bull Halsey led massive task forces across the Central Pacific, targeting the Marianas, Saipan, Tinian, and Guam. Capturing these islands would allow the United States to build airfields for the new B-29 super fortresses, which could strike Japan's home islands directly. Japan understood the stakes. To protect the Marianas, they launched one of their last major carrier offensives. What followed on June 19, 1944, was the Battle of the Philippine Sea Clash, so one-sided it became known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Wave after wave of Japanese aircraft attacked the American fleet. But American radar, disciplined formations, and experienced fighter pilots tore them apart. More than 300 Japanese planes were shot down in 2 days. Japan's remaining carrier air arm, once the elite of the world, was effectively annihilated. The Japanese fleet fled. The Marianas fell. And from those islands, American B-29s began the long, destructive bombing campaign that would eventually bring Japan to its knees. But before America could strike the Japanese home islands directly, one more decisive battle had to be fought. Leyte Gulf. In October 1944, General Douglas MacArthur began fulfilling his promise to return to the Philippines. In response, Japan launched its largest naval operation of the war, an all-or-nothing attempt to destroy the U.S. invasion fleet. The result was the largest naval battle in human history, a sprawling 4-part clash involving hundreds of ships, thousands of aircraft, and miles of ocean. There was the Battle of the Sibuyan Sea, where U.S. aircraft sank the giant battleship Musashi. The Battle of Surigao Strait, where American battleships crossed the T of the Japanese fleet in one of the last traditional battleship engagements ever fought. The Battle off Cap Engano, where U.S. carriers destroyed Japan's last operational carriers, used as decoys. And finally, the desperate Battle off Samar, where a small group of American escort carriers and destroyers, outgunned and outnumbered, faced off against a vastly superior Japanese force. Their courage and aggressive counterattacks forced the Japanese fleet to retreat. Leyte Gulf broke the backbone of Japan's navy for good. From this moment on, Japan relied on a new, terrifying weapon, kamikaze attacks. Young pilots, often with minimal training, flew aircraft loaded with explosives directly into American ships. Destroyers, carriers, transports, many were hit. The attacks were brutal, relentless, and emotionally devastating for the men who faced them. And yet, despite the fear and destruction, the American fleet continued its advance. Next came Iwo Jima. A volcanic island only 8 square miles in size, Iwo Jima was defended by 20,000 Japanese soldiers dug deep into tunnels and bunkers. For over a month, U.S. Marines fought a nightmare battle across black sand beaches and jagged terrain. The iconic image of Marines raising the flag atop Mount Suribachi became a symbol of American determination. But the cost was staggering, over 26,000 casualties. Then came Okinawa, the final stepping stone to Japan. The largest amphibious assault of the Pacific War, it lasted nearly 3 months. Kamikaze attacks reached their peak. The battleship USS Yamato, the largest ever built, sailed on a one-way suicide mission and was sunk by American aircraft before it could reach the invasion fleet. By the end, Okinawa had become one of the bloodiest battles of the entire war, with massive losses on both sides. By the summer of 1945, Japan was cornered. Its navy was gone, its cities were burning, and the United States was preparing for an invasion that was expected to cost hundreds of thousands of lives. Instead, the war ended with 2 atomic bombings, Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and Japan's surrender on September 2, 1945, aboard the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay. As the American flag rose above the deck, the Pacific War came to a close. The United States had fought from the ruins of Pearl Harbor to the gates of Tokyo, transforming itself into the world's most powerful naval force. Aircraft carriers proved their dominance. Battleships provided firepower and prestige. Submarines severed Japan's supply lines. And millions of Americans, sailors, pilots, marines, engineers, and factory workers had contributed to a victory that reshaped the world. The steel giants of the Pacific had done their part, and a new era of American naval power had begun.